Hello and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar, LGBTQ+ in STEM, using data to foster inclusion. I'm Natalie Starkey, Chemistry World's science media producer. If you've attended a Chemistry World webinar before, you might notice that GoToWebinar looks a bit different today as there's been an update to the software. So feel free to explore the layout, as you should be able to resize boxes and zoom in to make things look as you'd like them to. Now, the questions box still works the same as it used to, so please send in your questions for the panel and we'll be able to send you any links and other messages as usual in the chat box, which I think will appear when we put something in it. You should also have the option to turn on closed captions, which is a new part of the software, which is very exciting. So you can give all that a go today. Now, I'll also point out that this webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything today, want to watch again or share the webinar with friends and colleagues, then do look out in your inboxes in the next few days for a link to the recording. Now, this webinar is the second part of a two-part series where we're working together alongside the RSC's Inclusion and Diversity team. The first part of the series took place just a couple of weeks ago, where we heard from two other winners of the RSC LGBT+ Inclusion in STEM grant. We'll share a link to watch the recording of that webinar in the chat box. It's also on screen now, so I'll give you a moment to scan the link if you want to have a look at that on the QR code. But do bookmark that for later because there was lots of great content, some great speakers in that webinar. And we're focusing on slightly different things today, but with some more winners of the grant. Now, I just want to let you know that we do have a slight change to today's lineup, as unfortunately Abigail Powell from the University of Lincoln, who was due to speak today, is unfortunately unable to join us because she's come down with COVID. Now, fortunately, we do have plenty of content for today and a good amount of time for a discussion and questions for both Kevin, our moderator, and Marco, our main speaker. And that's all going to happen in the second half of the webinar. So we want to wish Abigail a speedy recovery, but what I can do is share a few details on screen now about her project, which she was going to speak about, called Barriers Within Barriers, Minorities Within Minorities, the challenges for LGBT+ inclusion in the UK-US STEM landscape through an intersectional lens. So Abigail shared some links to surveys as her team is still carrying out data collection for this project. The first link is for people working as scientists or engineers or in another STEM profession in the UK or the US who are willing to share their experiences of work. You do not have to identify as LGBTQ+ to participate, and you can skip any questions you don't want to answer. So take a scan of that link. I think we've also put that in the chat for you, so you can have a look at that later. The second link is for STEM employers in the UK or US. You can share your organisation's approach to EDI and supporting LGBTQ+ staff in STEM with this short anonymous policy and practice survey. So you've got the QR codes and the links for those. We'll share those again at the end of the webinar, so don't worry if you've missed those. But if you can help out with this research, that would be really great. And we're really sorry that Abigail couldn't join us today. Now, I don't want to take up too much more of your time before handing over to our speakers today, our moderator Kevin and Marco, but I wanted to let you know that as with all Chemistry World webinars, this session is interactive, which means you, of course, can ask questions about any aspect of what's covered in today's event. So please use the questions box to send in your questions as soon as they come to mind, and we'll have a look at those in the second half of the webinar. You won't usually be able to see other people's questions in the box, but don't worry, they're there. We can see them and we will start looking at those as soon as they come in. So please do start sending them. I'm going to come back at the end. So we've got, we're going to have a few speakers today. We've got, I'm going to introduce them all in a moment, but I'm going to be back right at the end for the panel Q&A with Kevin and Marco. So do have a think about what you might want to ask them. But without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Ali Palermo, who is Head of Global Inclusion at the RSC. Just get her camera on. Hi, Ali, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
It's good to have you here. That's all right. You're going to be talking a little bit about the RSC's work and efforts to foster inclusion for the LGBTQ+ community in STEM. And then you're going to be handing over to our moderator, Kevin, who's going to hand over to our speaker, Marco. And as I said, I'll be back at the end so we can ask them some of the amazing audience questions that are going to come in. So I'm going to leave it with you, Ali, now. We've got some slides coming up for you, and I'll be back in a bit.
Thank you. Very welcome to this second webinar on data to foster LGBT plus inclusion in STEM. Just a little bit about me before I start. As Natalie said, my name is Ale Palermo. I'm Head of Global Inclusion at the Royal Society of Chemistry, responsible for delivering the strategy, the inclusion and diversity strategy, and implementing the inclusion and diversity strategy across all areas for the chemical sciences. I also lead some international programs, large international programs, in particular related to the Global South. And what it actually brings us together as a team is thinking about how we can drive change to make more inclusive the science culture in the chemical sciences. At the RSC, we strongly believe that science should be for everyone. But today, in 2024, we know it isn't. Creating an inclusive and diverse science environment is not only the right moral thing to do, but it is also there's plenty of evidence that diversity is good for science, is good for innovation, is good for businesses, and of course, it will be good for society at large. However, we know that there are many underrepresented groups in science, and that people sometimes feel excluded and they feel that they don't belong to science. More specifically, LGBT plus people are badly underrepresented in STEM subjects. And both in the UK and in the US, LGBT people are not always welcome in STEM subjects, with a consequent lack of retention and disempowering of individuals. In 2019, we published a joint report from the Royal Society of Chemistry with the Institute of Physics and the Royal Astronomical Society. And investigating through this report the climate for LGBT plus individuals working and studying in the physical sciences. And our research showed that 28% of the LGBT plus respondents have sometimes considered leaving their career in STEM. When looking at trans and non-binary respondents, 20% of them have often considering leaving their workplace. So if we want to retain the best talent in science, we need to build a more inclusive and welcoming environment for LGBT plus individuals, as currently they are more likely to leave their STEM profession. And can I have the next slide, please? And from analyzing the results from this joint report and furthering our research and working with the community, at the Royal Society of Chemistry, we developed a toolkit to help tackling the key issues faced and identified for the LGBT plus community. And this toolkit provides a tool that for everyone that wants to take a part in positive change, either employers, colleagues, and LGBT plus individuals included. It also includes guidance for employers and LGBT scientists on international mobility, and in addition, the working environment experienced by trans and non-binary scientists and LGBT plus teachers. In the creation of this toolkit, we were mindful of all our audiences, including recognizing and directly addressing the LGBT scientists among those reading the toolkit. The toolkit is available in our website for everyone in our web pages and showcases our contribution towards accelerating progress for LGBT plus inclusivity. I, in particular, would like to highlight the allyship guidance as a resource for anyone who is looking to act as a lead in allyship for the LGBT plus individuals and colleagues, and also to act as a bystander and interventions as a bystander. Another important step on towards our goal of fostering, next slide please, fostering our LGBT plus inclusivity is our partnership with policymakers, creating opportunities for funding research in this area. And we know that governments and other organizations in both the UK and in the US are eager to create evidence-based retention policies. The problem, however, is that there are limited data available to make informed decisions. The UK and the US are together more than the sum of our parts in this issue, We collect different types of data, which together are extremely powerful. So we were very pleased to partner with the Science and Innovation Network in the US, which is part of the Forum Commonwealth Development Office in the UK, on a new and powerful research scheme, which is funded by the UK government through the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. This scheme is supporting 5 research collaborations as pilot studies to actively investigate the attrition and retention of LGBT+ groups in STEM. These unique projects bring together STEM and the social sciences to develop new transatlantic collaborations between UK and US. The findings from the research will directly feed into evidence to build policies to address attrition and retention of LGBT+ scientists in the 2 countries. And today, as Natalie mentioned, we are very excited to welcome one of the grant holders to share their work to improve LGBT+ inclusion in STEM. We must continue to work together so that STEM is truly for everyone. Creating an inclusive culture is essential for the LGBT+ community. Not only this will lead to better science, but ultimately to a more sustainable and successful society. And with this, I would like to introduce our moderator for the webinar, Kevin Coutinho. Kevin has been a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, Inclusion and Diversity Committee for the last 6 years. And your contributions, Kevin, have been very significant in the development of our positions, our strategies, by providing great insights and inspiration. So thank you very much, Kevin. Kevin is an equalities practitioner within higher education and the voluntary sector. He chairs the Board of Trustees for the Windsor Fellowship, which is a race, equality and diversity charity that promotes education, citizenship and employability. Before I ask you to moderate this conversation with Marco, I would like to, because you have been involved in all our activities, and in particular in this grant from the very beginning, in this scheme, I would appreciate hearing your opinion about the importance of this grant, or what can change this grant, and the importance of collaboration, transatlantic collaborations between UK and US scientists to understand LGBT+ exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ali. I first have to acknowledge your contribution and your team's contribution to the work that's been done. I think what really stands out when we look at LGBTQ+ experience in STEM and research in this area is that unlike in other areas such as gender or race, where I think we have a much better understanding of the issues, this is a relatively under-researched area. And that's partly because the issue is relatively still evolving in terms of what it means for people in their careers in STEM, but also because as societies, we are not all in the same place about what LGBTQ+ inclusion means, for one, the group as a whole, but also the understanding of the specific issues for the subgroups, the lesbian, the gay, bisexual, and trans communities. And that is just the communities, but as societies, that transnational, international understanding can provide us both with learning and development opportunities in terms of how we understand what inclusion means in the study place or the workplace or the research environment. Because we're at different stages in our inclusion of the different groups, but more importantly, as a society, how we accept and embrace diversity. Now, the transatlantic partnership is relatively innovative because the UK and the US isn't traditionally where we would normally historically go for transnational research. That would normally be Europe. But again, the European context, the US-UK context, but also the broader Commonwealth context provides different experiences of the positions of LGBTQ+ communities within each of those societies, but also how we go about understanding what the issues are. In the UK, we do have quite a lot of data to help us, but actually how we engage with data may not be as consistent and should we say, as thorough as it could be. Conversation that I've learned from the US side is that actually the data gathering exercise isn't as easy, and in some European countries, data is not possible to collect. And in Commonwealth countries, there are still several Commonwealth countries where it's possibly legal to be out an LGBTQ, but more importantly, that then makes inclusion much more difficult to understand and actually deliver. So this project is distinctive and unique. So I'm very, very happy to moderate this, the second and final part of the LGBTQ in STEM webinar series, because data. Thank you, Ali. Data for us is critical for us as researchers and scientists and as a community of practitioners for EDI, for equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion, to understand what issues we face and encounter. So we're very lucky to actually have had this opportunity to explore what does data mean, how do we bridge the transatlantic UK and US experiences together, but then what can we draw on from both qualitative data and quantitative data to inform what we do as policymakers. So today we're very lucky to hear from an inspirational speaker who will tell us about their work and their motivations to improve LGBTQ plus inclusion in STEM using an evidence-based and evidence-driven approach. Our speaker will discuss the challenges and advantages of using qualitative data to discover and untangle factors influencing the attrition and retention of LGBTQ plus scientists in the UK and the US. We've asked our speaker to give us a presentation, to give us a little taster of what their project was about. We'll then move on to a discussion session to answer any questions about their work, and I'm going to ask for audience members in the session, please do add your questions to the question function. So I'm going to ask Dr. Marco Reggiani to come in a minute and give his presentation. Marco is a research associate at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. He has a PhD in architecture from the University of Tokyo in Japan and a master's in building and architectural engineering from the University of Bologna in Italy. He's been researching urban development, place identity, mobilities, and public life, particularly in the context of Japan and equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM subjects. This has included exploring the experiences of LGBTQ plus people and women in STEM and designing initiatives to remove barriers to inclusion for historically marginalized and excluded individuals. I'd now like to invite Marco to give his presentation about their project, Creating Change by Telling the Whole Story, making the case for qualitative research methods to strengthen LGBTQ plus retention in STEM in the US and the UK. So Marco, please, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, for your introduction, and thanks to the RSC for inviting me today and for coordinating this fantastic funding opportunity. Before starting my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that as all the other projects funded under this initiative, also our project, LGBTQ+, that stands for this much longer title, Creating Change by Telling the Whole Story, making the case for qualitative research methods to strengthen LGBTQ+ retention in STEM in the US and the UK. So also our project is a collaborative project. So there are other 3 people that are working on this project with me, and they are Dr. Jessica Gagnon from the University of Manchester, Dr. Timothy Atherton from Tufts University in Boston, and Dr. Ramon Barthelemy, who's working with us as a consultant from the University of Utah. So broadly, our project has 4 key aims. So we want to examine career pathways for LGBTQ+ people in STEM, including mapping the field of institutions, social actors, and power relations that shape attrition and retention for LGBTQ+ scientists in the UK and the US. But we also want to explore a topic that is quite dear to me, which is the multiple and embodied strategies of invisibility that are employed by LGBTQ+ scientists to navigate their career pathways, and how these experiences might contribute to reducing attrition and improving inclusion and retention. We also want to enhance understanding of the purpose and potential impact of qualitative and mixed method approaches for developing transformative policies, practices, and interventions. So we have this focus on qualitative data. And we will also build a network for sharing best practices for engaging with qualitative methods. So why do we focus on qualitative data? Well, we do that for different reasons. The first being that we believe that improving inclusion and retention of LGBTQ+ people in STEM requires multifaceted, multidisciplinary, and intersectional approaches, which are often lacking at the moment. Also, studies exploring the experiences of LGBTQ+ people in STEM have employed a wide range of methods, yet quantitative data is favored amongst policy and decision makers. Qualitative data, by comparison, can be misunderstood and devalued by stakeholders. So at the moment, stakeholders and policymakers are not making that much use of qualitative data. Qualitative data, though, can be very interesting because it enables a more thorough and nuanced understanding about the experiences of and barriers faced by historically underrepresented groups, including LGBTQ+ people in STEM, especially those who are multiply marginalized, who face complex and compounded discrimination. For example, disabled LGBTQ+ people of color in STEM. I think Kevin was already kind of hinting at the fact that we need to understand the experiences of communities within the LGBTQ+ community. As part of the project activities, we will conduct a literature review to critically explore and identify methodological gaps for understanding and addressing attrition and retention of LGBTQ+ people in STEM. We are conducting focus groups and workshops, to examine career pathways for LGBTQ+ people in STEM, addressing existing knowledge gaps, and model good methodological practices. We will develop guidance to understanding of the purpose and potential impact of qualitative methods for developing transformative policies, practices, and intervention. And we will organize in a couple of months a symposium to build a network, share best practices, and disseminate findings. In today's presentation, I will particularly focus on the second of these activities to showcase and highlight some preliminary findings from our focus groups in the UK. So moving toward what we are finding through our data collection, I want to share some overall demographic information of our UK participants. So far, we have spoken with 18 participants. So in terms of gender identity, 39% identified as men, 28% as women, 22% as non-binary or genderqueer, and 11% as agender. 44% of our participants identified as trans. This is a quite significant percentage for a small qualitative study. We have a wide range of identities that are represented in terms of sexuality and sexual orientation. So 22% of our participants identified as asexual, 17% as bisexual, 33% as gay, 22% as lesbian, 17% as pansexual, 50% as queer, 6% as questioning, 6% as woman-loving women. And just to mind that participant could select more than one identity when it comes to their sexuality. 28% of participants identified as disabled. This is quite consistent across the various studies I have done in this space. And in terms of race ethnicity, 85% identified as white British or other white backgrounds, 2 participants identified as people of color, and 1 as a white ethnic minority in the UK. So we have started to identify some preliminary themes from our focus groups. The first one being that, talking with our participant, we can say that progress has been made in this space, and this is also due to the efforts of institutions like the RSC, to bring awareness and sometimes solutions for issues that LGBTQ+ people in STEM face. However, there are persisting barriers and exclusion for LGBTQ+ people in STEM and more broadly in higher education and research or industry organizations. It's important to notice that challenges, even those that might have happened in the past or to other people, so incidents that you might have observed, challenges have far-reaching consequences on career journeys and increase the risk of attrition, one of the main topic of this funding call. So challenges that we have identified include lack of visibility, transphobia and homophobia, heteronormativity and gender stereotypes, lack of opportunity, lack of understanding of LGBTQ plus issue, lack of intersectionality, and many more. There's a wide range of challenges within our data, unsurprisingly. So I'm presenting here a lengthy quote from one of our participants, Ava, a transgender woman who's an academic in STEM in the UK. And I chose this lengthy quote because it illustrates quite beautifully the topic of visibility. That is something I'm quite focused on. So in the first paragraph, in a way, Ava is describing some of the challenges that she experienced with visibility in the past. I was probably working in science and engineering for more than 10 years, so for quite a long time, also including my degree, and then working in industry, and then my PhD. It was about more than 10 years without seeing any LGBT plus people, and openly LGBT plus people, I should say. That lack of visibility made me think, you can't be LGBT in STEM, so I quit. And I was actually going to move to a completely different field. I only really stayed in STEM by accident. So you can see here the lack of visibility might lead some people to quit their field. This didn't happen to Ava, who stayed in STEM. However, once she became visible, new challenges appeared. Once I came out, I became quite visible. The people around me are really good. There were job offers and some groups that no longer want to work with me. It's never directly for particular reasons, but all of a sudden they wanted to work with me and now they don't. So, you can sort of infer from that that this has to do with me transitioning. And then I do get targeted. I get targeted quite a lot online. I also found a transphobic sticker in my department today. So this second part of the quote shows that while visibility can be beneficial, it's not a sort of magic bullet that is going to solve all the problem for LGBTQ plus people in STEM, because actually by being visible, you might expose yourself to other sort of challenges, in this case, transphobia. Another theme that we started to identify is that when describing their career journeys, so including times when they were wondering whether to leave STEM, participants shared that the presence of positive and affirming factors was key to their retention. Among these factors, there are mentors, having a supportive mentor, or having a supporting supervisor and colleagues. Participant mentioned as positive also having role models or being themselves a role model for others. Supportive networks, both within and outside their institution, were identified also as beneficial, as well as supportive policies and practices in their institution. For example, policies around name change, medical leave, or hate speech, the presence of which was really identified as beneficial for their career progression or to face certain kind of challenges. Some participants described how, when discussing the perception that they had of inclusion initiatives in their institution, some participants described that too often they felt that their institution focused on passive inclusion rather than taking proactive measures to remove structural barriers for LGBTQ plus people in STEM, which is really what matters when it comes to attrition and retention. So the message here is that commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion must be coupled with mechanisms for accountability. And the quote here from Rebecca, who's a staff member in a research and industry organization, is a lesbian woman of color, is quite exemplary of this theme. So Rebecca is saying it's easy enough to just see that things looks good on a website or that something in your contract looks okay. This is the passive inclusion I was talking about. But when you see that an authentic safe space is being curated where people like me can actually share who they are, then it makes you feel safer to talk about yourself. and know that it's somewhere that you can excel, that people like you are actually progressing, it gives you more confidence in your own ability and opportunity. So seeing that in your organization, there's a safe space, people like you are retained, people like you are progressing. This is what really matters to give you that confidence in your ability and opportunities. Even in our relatively, small sample of participants, we found that there are significant differences in the sector, both across and within regions or within UK nations. Participants take these differences in consideration when applying to a program or taking up an employment offer. And we have an example here from Luke, a gay early career academic from Northern Ireland. He's saying, I'm from Northern Ireland, I moved to England now for my postdoc, and I probably will stay here, if not go further afield, because Northern Ireland is still so behind. When I was interested in institution for my new role, I would go onto their LGBT page or links to check information. I did enjoy my PhD and undergrad, so back in Northern Ireland, but I was like, I want to fully thrive in a department where I can see people like me. So again, this theme of visibility that comes back again, but also, the idea that there are some places that are more welcoming than others. So a lot of participants share that when deciding where to work, they thought really carefully about location, and that further restricted their option, because of course, if half of the places that are available are in places where you don't feel safe, your pool, as an applicant, decrease. Finally, we also would like to highlight as an emergent theme that addressing EDI issues for LGBTQ plus people require addressing long-standing issues within STEM institutional and professional cultures. So there's a bigger picture here that concern STEM fields and not just LGBTQ plus people. So in the first quote is a PhD student, Francisco, speaking, saying, people care too much about the engineering and the materials and the math and the paper and the titles and the money. But what about the people? You cannot be a scientist without being a person. That's very beautiful. That's very true. And Rebecca, again, here saying something similar when reflecting on the work in her organization and how things changed over the years. Historically, we kind of just thought of career in STEM as work to equation or design instruments or applying science to new things. Now, people are expecting that their whole selves will be appreciated in the work that they are doing. Institutions need to keep up with what's happening, to keep up with our competitors. So things are changing, people have different expectations, have different experiences, and they bring that into their work, and they expect to be recognized, to be appreciated as their whole selves. And institution, organization need to start to recognize this and improve the work they are doing. And this is very important in terms of being resilient in the future. Ali mentioned innovation, diversity and inclusion are very important for innovation. And here we see is also very important to keep up with a very competitive research landscape that we have nowadays. So what are the impact and outcomes of our findings, our preliminary findings? So we see, as we expected in a way, that the qualitative data that we collected offer a nuanced and intersectional insight into issues of attrition and retention for LGBTQ plus people in STEM. In particular, and that's very important in terms of the aim for this funding call, qualitative data provides contextual insight into participants' lived experiences of policies and intervention and lack thereof. And this is key to review existing policies and practices, see if they work, if they don't work, how they are perceived, but also to inform future interventions. Our preliminary findings suggest that addressing attrition and retention for LGBTQ plus people in STEM is a complex endeavor which requires systemic, intersectional, sector-wide and because of the focus that we have, US-wide approaches. This is not something that a single institution can solve. We all need to work together to solve this problem. So that's it from me today. We are still recruiting for focus group, both in the US and the UK. So I invite you to visit our website to keep updated with new dates in case you would like to join our study. And on the 6th of September, we will host a symposium at the University of Manchester where we will discuss more data and more about the importance of qualitative data to address attrition and retention for LGBTQ+ people in STEM. So you are very welcome to participate. And again, if you follow us on our website, on our social media, you will hear in due time some updates on the symposium. And I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was a very insightful presentation, because I think in STEM we often focus on the quantitative approaches to data collection. And I think given the nature of LGBTQ+ communities, being able to understand the multiple layers of identities that can compound senses of exclusion and invisibility in STEM, but also in society more broadly, helps us to tease out how we as organizations, as strategic bodies in STEM, can help to foster a more inclusive environment. So I'm going to start by flagging up 2 points that both Marco and Abigail are saying that they're still open to participants. So my first call is to say to all participants here, consider your voice being heard by participating. Secondly, if you haven't asked a question and you'd like to, please use the question function in this app to actually write your questions down. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that we have. And I think really, Marco, it's important to really think about how do we really use both qualitative data to complement existing quantitative data that we may hold? And could you just think about actually explaining to colleagues how that can be done effectively?
Thanks for your question, Kevin. This is a very complicated question, of course. And yes, as I was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, policymakers tend to focus on quantitative data rather than qualitative data that are often dismissed in various ways. If you do this work, when you speak with policymakers, they say things like, oh, how can you make sure that this is not just the story of this individual? Oh, your sample is too small, your data are not generalizable. But this is not the goal of qualitative research. So qualitative research should be used to get this more complex, in-depth understanding of experiences. And this, I think, is key to address complex human problems. There's no simplistic one-size-fits-all solution for, in this case, retention and attrition of LGBTQ+ people in STEM, and only by understanding, exploring the experiences of individuals, we can then kind of gain that holistic, complex understanding that can allow us to move forward. And as you were mentioning, I use the expression of an LGBTQ+ communities rather than community, because there's no such a thing as a monolithic LGBTQ+ community, but there's a lot of differences within our communities. There's a lot of intersections when it comes to the sort of oppression and privilege that we experience in life, and often these kind of differences are missed in large-scale surveys, but they are easier to capture in conversations, for example, or in focus groups.
Oh, that's really helpful. I think that nuanced understanding will help us to get our responses to be more tailored and appropriate for different members of our communities. One of the things that I highlighted earlier on when we came to this project was that actually, whilst there are commonalities between the UK and the US, and also clearly different experiences for European countries, Commonwealth countries, what I wanted to find out through this project, in what ways are UK and US data collection and collation different for LGBTQ plus STEM communities?
Well, that's another very interesting question, because I would start by saying, you mentioned, I think in the introduction, that we have a lot of data in the UK. Well, yes and no, I would say, because we certainly have data, but similarly to the US, they are not systematically collected, they are not easy to access, and there's a lot of gaps within data. So certain institutions might collect some data around sexuality, some other institution might not collect them. We might not have the right data that we need to understand, for example, issues of retention and attrition over time. So I think that this kind of challenge exists both in the States and in the UK. There are other things that we somehow discovered through the project that we were not expecting, and that sometimes complicate, kind of comparing results across countries. For example, what we define as STEM, or the kind of disciplines that exist within this space. This definition is different in the US compared to the UK. Obviously, there are different sort of demographic categories that are employed in the two countries, but we kind of expected that. So, yeah, like I think working across country can be extremely beneficial, but is also extremely challenging. I'm not sure if I fully responded to your question or if I expanded somewhere else.
I suppose really what I want to understand, and I think might be helpful for audience members to understand, is that actually there's a process through which you need to figure out how we can make data comparisons more reliable and easier to do in a systematic way than obviously just approaching it from one country's perspective. When we within the same system, we tend to develop approaches to data and data collection, even terminology that can make it easier for us to understand each other. When you do this transnationally, it can become more complex. And so I suppose really teasing that out a little bit would be quite helpful.
Yeah, I think in a way, since we are focusing on qualitative data in our project, qualitative data is well positioned to facilitate, in a way, this translation, because given that we are developing themes based on the experiences of our participants, we have found, although I didn't illustrate findings from the state, but we identified a lot of similarities in terms of experiences that make it much easier to compare data when you compare, for example, surveys, because surveys rely a lot on those fixed categories that I was describing before that might be problematic, because if you use different demographic categories, or if you include disciplines in one country as STEM and in another country they are not considered, then it becomes really, really difficult to use this data and to kind of understand what lies behind, behind the data in a way, because that's one of the problems that a lot of surveys has. We say that there was those findings from the survey done by the RSC at the beginning, saying, 28% of our LGBTQ plus respondents considered leaving their field. But why? The survey might not say that, but we might get an understanding of why by doing the work that we are doing.
Well, that's really very helpful. And one of the things that obviously appeals to me very importantly in this space is around intersectionality. And I suppose really what we wanted to understand as well is, how did you implement an intersectional approach in the qualitative data collection and analysis to better articulate the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus scientists?
Yeah, that's an incredibly complicated question as well. We could have a whole webinar just on how to sort of implement and translate intersectionality in study design and analysis. So what we really need to do is design instruments to collect data that allow us to capture, experiences around different social identities and the intersecting systems of oppression and privilege that people experience. So, for example, we put a lot of care into developing, demographic questionnaires to capture a full spectrum of social identities, but also we put a lot of care in developing focus group questions that would prompt participants to describe experiences at the intersection of different social identities. Then when it comes to analysis, it's our job as researchers to interpret these stories and understand where those intersections lie. Intersectionality is not an object that exists in the world, it's not a pen. It's something that we need to understand. It's something really complicated because human experience is very complicated.
Thank you, Marco. Natalie, welcome back.
Thank you. This has been amazing. Wow. What a brilliant discussion. And Marco, that presentation was excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. We've got some audience questions coming in, which is lovely to see. Lots of different information being shared. One of the things actually someone's pointed out in the questions box, and it made me think, people might ask, why is this research important? And, it's a fair enough question. They might think, well, it's a small minority of people. Why do we care? Why are we putting, this effort in? But actually, the study that this person's pointed to suggests that I think it's 17% of Generation Z identify as LGBTQ+. Now, this is one study, but potentially what we're looking at is generations moving forward. It might be that, more people are identifying into these groups, and therefore, this research is becoming even more important as we move forward. So I think that's really interesting. And I'm like, yeah, I actually didn't know it was that high. So I don't know, have you kind of seen that? Obviously, your research, the people that take part in your focus groups, maybe they're kind of already self-selecting. But is that something you're kind of seeing?
Definitely what I noticed, in terms of participants compared to previous studies, younger participants tend to identify more as this non-binary, genderqueer when it comes to gender identity. In this study, we had a higher percentage of participants who identified as trans. This can have various reasons. But when you were saying, yes, we need to explain. This is funded research. Is a valid question to ask why this research is important. And there can be many different arguments made here on why this is important. So there is a sort of social justice side to this question. Is important because queer people in STEM have been discriminated for many, many years. So the right thing to do is address this discrimination and remove these barriers. Of course, there's also a business case to inclusion. We were hinting at that before. More diversity and inclusion in research teams. There's plenty of research showing that this produces better results. This in turn can produce, more profit for your organization, can make your organization more attractive and more resilient. And we know how important it is to attract students and staff for university, especially now.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We've got a question about data collection. Now, obviously, we're discussing sensitive topics, and I think this question relates really to kind of fear of repercussions and how we might deal with low reporting or unwillingness to share, and how does that impact the conclusions that you can draw from the data you've collected?
So thanks for this question. This is an absolutely key concern for us as researchers. These are very sensitive topic. So the safety of our participant is paramount. We have developed a very thorough protocol to anonymize or pseudo-anonymize our data, so removing identifiable information. We don't see that as a problem in a way because we are trained researchers to deal with that. But you are right, in general surveys, especially those that are maybe managed by universities or institutions, people might fear to join these data collection exercises because they don't know how their data will be used. Is it completely anonymous? If I report that I'm gay in the HR system, will there be repercussion for my employment? And these are very valid concerns. So I would invite institutions that collect this data to be really mindful about the way they collect the data, and to communicate very explicitly with participants in this survey what are the protocols in place to safeguard those data, what happens, who has access to the data, how long are the data, how long will they be retained? Do you have the right to withdraw your data or not? These are all very important questions that need to be answered if we want to reach a population like, LGBTQ plus.
And we're all much more aware of how, that our data can get out and things. And so I think people are going to be wary, and, we see it all the time. So I think, that's a really valid point, that actually it needs to be addressed, because if you want that information, if people aren't willing to share, then it's causing a massive barrier to collecting the data.
And just a quick follow-up on this, which is very important, is like people are more willing to participate in a study or in a survey if they see that the results are going to be used to produce positive change for them. And this is something that we demonstrated with previous projects, and that's why we were able to reach some participants, because people trust us. People saw that we used data to make some positive change. But now people are also very, very aware that sometimes people are just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. And when participants kind of perceive this, they are not very likely to join your study, for example.
It's also important to socialize communities around the acceptability of collecting and monitoring data and sharing data in these spaces, because both the UK and the US particularly have seen a large and significant internationalization of both staff and student communities. But many of our students and staff colleagues come from countries where, one, data collection around sexual orientation, religion or belief, or disability status or ethnicity may be illegal or not commonly done. And some people may come from countries where it is illegal to be gay and can be a criminal offense. So we've got to think about, actually, how do we make people aware that in the country that we're doing this research in, that it is safe, but also as institutional cultures, that data is going to be treated sensitively and also not be used in ways that may put you at risk should you return to your home country at some point in the future.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. Thank you. That was great answer to that question. I've got a question for both of you, and it's about kind of policymakers. How can policymakers, researchers and funding bodies incorporate the findings and recommendations from these kinds of projects to better support the LGBT plus scientists in the UK and the US? This is the impact of this work, and that's a really great question. We're doing all this great work. What's going to happen at the end?
Well, first of all, I think... Go ahead, Marco, you start.
No, go ahead, Kevin.
So I think what attracted me to this project when the RSC first started looking at this was actually that this was such an under-researched area. So from my work experience and knowledge of equality and inclusion issues in higher education, I knew that there were individual research doing this work. It's not something that people haven't been researching. What this project has done is draw together and provide framing around which a strategic perspective and a set of different projects could be resourced. And that provides capacity. So if you were doing a qualitative research project by itself, the significance of that could often be thought as lesser than if it wasn't complemented by the quantitative. Similarly, quantitative findings without qualitative insights will be less useful. So combined, these projects provide a relatively coherent set of initiatives that can be used by organizations singularly, but also research funding bodies to look at issues around LGBTQ plus inclusion, both in the UK and in the US, but also create relevance elsewhere where the research may not have already been undertaken. So it provides a foundation upon which research and understanding of the issues of exclusion can be understood, and then a strategy to address these can be then taken forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Marco?
Just to add, as a very maybe practical suggestion, policymaker can work with us. We are doing the research, we have the data, we have an in-depth understanding of this problem. So we would be very happy to work with policymakers to help them to review their policies or to develop something new that they don't currently have. It would be very important also for them, however they use our data, to involve LGBTQ plus communities when developing policies. Because, we have our own understanding of the problem, but there's so many other perspectives, so many other lived experiences that we might not have captured in our research. So whenever we develop a policies that is targeting a certain minoritized group, that group needs to be involved in the process and should be compensated for the input that they are providing to your policymaking efforts.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. We have a question, a good question about allyship. In 2024, what does effective allyship look like for the LGBTQ plus individuals in STEM? I think that's great. I'm hoping you're going to give me a positive message now that will tell people, what can we do if we want to be an ally?
I think it starts with, I think it starts with what's my mindset around who I am and what my positionality is. So allyship forms part of what I would describe as my approach to inclusive leadership. And actually, whenever I take on a role, whatever that role is, I need to be mindful of, I know I don't represent myself. I want to see change that embraces and enables and celebrates all communities. If I'm doing this work for myself and only for myself, that's no good in my mind. I want to see how I can enable women, people that don't share my identities, to also thrive, because when they thrive, I can thrive too. So it's about recognizing the value that it's simply good practice for everybody. If we include all our communities and everybody can come to their workplace or study place and be themselves and be able to do that, as a leader, I'm going to have a better, more effective community of colleagues. And going back to what Ali said earlier, we, when we have inclusive research, we don't just benefit our organizations and our immediate teams, we benefit society overall. And our role as leaders in society is really important. And in getting that message out there that actually research is and STEM is for everyone. If you're interested in and you have the talent, we want you to come into STEM.
I'll just pick up on something you said there. So do you think allyship, it's very important that it comes from the top, that it's top down? Obviously, do you think that's a major component in that leadership has to be on board with this?
Well, leadership has to give the cue that actually this is something that within organizations we value. And by placing value, that can often mean around whether the work is recognized, whether funding is available, whether the policies and structures say that this is important. That sends the right cue. But actually, leadership starts from the bottom, whether it's your custodian, your cleaner, your cook, all the way up to your president. If you walk into an organization and you feel or you get the wrong look or comment, it doesn't matter who it comes from. It can still make you feel like you don't belong, because belonging comes from our community, and everyone belongs in our community, or nobody does. And therefore, when you say, does it come from the top, it comes actually from everyone. And I encourage that approach because in any capacity or any role that you have some degree of agency. The question is, do you see that agency? And for me, allyship isn't just for the person that I'm supporting or perhaps enabling. It comes from the fact that it could be me on the other end of that experience at a different occasion. It could be somebody that I care about or somebody that I love. So I recognize that value that's intrinsic for me as an individual, as a human being, and then I take that into my workplace. Though leadership has it, I would say leaders within organizations do have an additional responsibility to get that messaging done well.
Yeah, I think that was just a brilliant answer. Marco, I don't know if there is anything to add to that, but I expect you might have something to say.
I mean, it's a great answer from Kevin. Something very quick because we are about to reach 4 p.m. Something that I would add here is that allyship needs to be active. And you need to educate yourself if you want to be an ally. You don't have to expect, although I'm happy to discuss and educate others, there shouldn't be the expectation that LGBTQ plus community have to educate you on these issues. There's plenty of materials available. We have seen the report from RSC, we have seen the toolkit. There's plenty more material that you can access to learn at least the basic things, terminology, issues in order to, kind of start to get an understanding of the issues that we are talking about. So yes, educate yourself would be
Absolutely.
a very
it's
important first step.
It's keeping up as well, isn't it, with the language? I feel like it is quite a fast-moving field in some ways. Things are changing all the time, and I think that's important that we stay up to date as well with what's happening. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I think, Kevin, we've got a resources slide we're going to bring up. I think you wanted to say a few words there. So we'll bring that up now, and I'll hand over to you for a minute.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So as we've talked about, the RSC, the Royal Society of Chemistry, has been really focused on trying to include increased diversity and inclusion across the whole chemical sciences community. So I want to remind colleagues here that there are many resources that we have that are freely available on the web pages. Ali mentioned them at the beginning of this webinar. There are reports into different areas, so breaking the barriers, missing elements, our LGBTQ plus toolkit, and there's also we've recently introduced our Disability Web Hub, which again is an additional resource, because there are many facets to this conversation and these conversations that we're having. And I think goes back to the point Marco was saying earlier. We're not a homogenous community, and we'll come with multiple intersectional identities. But please do use them, if nothing else, to inform yourself, because Marco's point about education is key. And that's whether you're just starting out in your journey or whether you're a senior leader. There's probably something there that might help you to improve your practice. I'm going to hand back to you if I can.
Yeah, Natalie, that's brilliant. And we are just about out of time. I just wanted to share the next slide, which for those of you who maybe missed just the beginning of the webinar, our other speaker, Abigail, was unfortunately able to join us today because she's poorly, but the surveys for her project are still ongoing. So if you want to take part in those surveys, the links are on the screen. I think my colleague will get them shared into the chat as well. There's one that is for people working in STEM, and the other one is if you're an employer in the UK or US. In both cases, you can fill out those surveys, and that would be really helpful for the research. As you've probably seen from today's presentations, we need to gather these data to understand what's going on, what the situation is. And as a reminder, the first part of this webinar series took place a couple of weeks ago. And we heard from two other winners of the grant. So there's a link to the recording that you can see on our page or on the Chemistry World YouTube page. That's on the screen now and shared in the chat box. So do go back and take a look at that if you missed it. It was another great conversation, as today also has been. If you missed anything today, or you want to just watch again or share with friends or colleagues, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar to everyone who registered. That will go out in the next few days, so do look out for that. And all that's really left to say is thank you so much to our speakers today. We had Ali at the beginning, Kevin for moderating so brilliantly, and Marco, what an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. I found it fascinating today, so thank you to both of you. And also thanks to the audience. We've had some lovely comments in the questions box and some good questions. So thank you so much for getting involved. If you've enjoyed this webinar, then please do check out chemistryworld.com/webinars for future events. We'll have a lot more coming up after the summer. We have a little break for August, and then we'll be back with lots more webinars. So from everyone here at Chemistry World, we look forward to seeing you in a future Chemistry World webinar. Thank you.